Frankly, I sympathize with all those who'd like to skip Friday this week and move right on to Sunday. It's not for the chocolate thing or the flowers thing or the joy thing per se. It's just that darkness and death, ingredients of the so-called Good Friday, aren't appealing. Especially when the life of our world, seems to have more than enough of darkness and death. There is an old tale, as almost everything is about Easter, that after his death, Jesus, in some kind of form, we're in a poetic metaverse rather than a physiological one here, descended to hell, Sheol, Hades, the pit, where Judas was, and comforted him. Over a coffee, maybe, beer. That's what Jesus was doing on his Holy Saturday. He wasn't hanging with God the Father in glory, giving the angels high fives, but hanging where the omnipotent deity was not, in hell, with Judas in his hell. What appeals in this telling tale is the idea that failure, betrayal, destructive remorse, deep hurt, the fracturing and collapse of friendship might not have the final word. No matter how bad, no bad is the final word. The end. What this tale is saying is that when you have betrayed another badly, when the consequences of that betrayal are overwhelming, all-consuming, when you go down deep into the pit, where light is hazy, into a place where God is not, this might not be your end. The long reach of love might follow you even there. What do we know about Judas as portrayed in the Bible? Well, chronologically speaking, he doesn't show up in the early writings like those of St. Paul's authentic letters, but makes his first appearance in after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. When Mark's piece was written. Note the destruction of the temple turned the lives and faith of Jews, both those inside and outside Palestine, upside down. The temple was the great center and symbol of Jewish identity, religion, and resilience. Surely it fell not because of a failure of faith, but because of traitors. Judas, if there was an actual factual Judas, is painted as a loyal disciple, one of the guys who made it into a favored 12, the 12, the big 12. He was said to be a keeper of the purse, accountant, who found Jesus' endorsement of extravagance, as in our first reading this morning, by the woman with the hair and the perfume, offensive. I would suggest, though, that Judas wasn't a miser, as the anti-Semitic revisionists would later portray him, or a trader who would sell his friend and his loyalty for 30 pieces of silver. Rather, I'd like to think of Judas as committed to the Isaiah come Jesus vision of good news for the poor, but was puzzled and then dismayed by the strategy Jesus was pursuing to achieve it. Instead, he came to think Jesus was being destructive of the very movement he had initiated. Jesus seemed to be self-absorbed, intent on martyrdom, setting his face to Jerusalem. Of course, Judas wasn't alone. Psychologists have long suggested that Judas was articulating the discomfort, fears, and contrary thinking of a whole group of disciples. In the last week of his life, when Jesus was sore vexed in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter, James, and John showed their solidarity. "We're with you, bro," by falling asleep. With Jesus, when Jesus was arrested, Peter, despite the schooling that this movement was non-violent, draws a sword. What didn't you get, Peter? Then he thrice denied knowing Jesus. Come crucifixion time, they all took off, save maybe for some of the women. All the men felt they had betrayed him. Not just Judas. But Judas was and is still the one vilified, the one labeled as the traitor. As for the moment of betrayal, when Judas is alleged to have led a large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and elders of the people and identified Jesus with a kiss, any Sunday school graduate could point out the flaw. Because hadn't the same Jesus just ridden in Jerusalem, plain view on a donkey? Didn't everybody know this guy? Wouldn't any Tom, Dick, or Moshe know how to identify him? But let's stay in the poetic multiverse and not get too picky. Later in Matthew's Gospel, we're told that Judas returned the silver to the chief priests, plural, lamenting, "I have sinned in betraying innocent blood," and then went and hung himself. In case you're tempted to think of this as history, Jesus was not innocent. Pilate did not make a mistake. The chief priests, singular, did not determine Jesus' fate. Jesus determined his own fate when he publicly preached a message subversive of the ideology and violence of the Roman Empire. He wouldn't shut up, so they shut him up. As for Judas, if there was a literal Judas, we know nothing factual about his fate. Yet the tradition of Judas is appealing in that it says that not all who followed Jesus made a success of it. Not all who followed were in that upper room where the spirit of empowerment came calling. Not all who followed were resurrected and experienced in their hearts and accompanied Jesus as alive. Indeed, one was so overwhelmed by his sense of failure, his sense of betrayal, his taking of money to do a terrible thing, that he killed himself and was wiped from the story. One was a failure. Failure is not the end. Yet so much of our society says it is. So much and so many say there are so many things that you can do, sins you can commit, messes up that matter, that you can't come back from. The consequences have to be lived with. You reap what you sow, so you have to rot in hell. The end. And the Western Church, Catholic and Protestant, has dined out on this judgmental religion for so long, fashioning faith as a courtroom, condemning so many. If you were good or repented and proved it, you went to hell. Or you went to heaven, sorry. And if you weren't or didn't, well, you're off to the other place, to hell. These were permanent placements. The consequence of punishment undergirded church and society. Only in the last century of two, particularly in liberal Protestantism, has this begun to be debunked. But the Eastern Church, right from the beginning, offered a different vision. Jesus' resurrection was a universal resurrection, the resurrection of all humanity. And what happened in 33 CE, or was it 30 CE, was stage one. Jesus, after he died, descended, remember this is a poetic multiverse, to hell, where he flattened or smashed the gates, the harrowing of hell. And they led all the captives of hell, everybody in the place, out of their imprisonment. Hell was done away with. A whole tier of the universe was now redundant. There was no one in the basement. The Western and Eastern religious versions of hell are important in that the West said, lock up the bad, throw away the key, keep them apart from us. And our penal system was based on it. And he said, live with the bad, help them be free. They are a part of us. Somewhere in the midst of all that descending, smashing, and liberating, Jesus found time to have a coffee with Judas. The long reach of love connected them in hell. Together they sat and sipped. Was Judas remorseful or depressed? Was Jesus similarly remorseful or depressed? Did they feel like they had failed each other? Did they feel like powers beyond their friendship had conspired to drive them apart? Were they mad with each other? Did they comfort each other? The old tale about this time together of Judas and Jesus having a coffee doesn't give answers to these or other questions. We have to fill them in ourselves or leave them pending. Sitting together again after friendship, loyalty, betrayal, and suffering is a rare gift to offer another. Maybe they didn't say anything, just sat in silence and savored each other's presence.